Chapter 8 Exploring the Terrible and Wonderful Land. The Southern Expedition Party of Hurley, Page and Webb travelled south on their long trek towards the southern magnetic pole. For the first part of the journey, they were accompanied by the support team of Hunter, the biologist, Murphy, the stallmaster, and Lazaron, the taxidermist. At around the 100-kilometre mark, the support team laid down a supply depot and bid their farewells to the Southern Party. Lazaron later wrote in his diary that his last memory was a glimpse of Hurley's cheerful grin. The three men, pulling a single sled, continued and laid down a second supply cache, which they called the Lucky Depot, at around the 350-kilometre mark. Their journey south was not without its perils. On one occasion, Hurley fell into a crevasse and had to be hauled out by Page and Webb. By the 21st of December, they were 450 kilometres from the hut. They wrote that they were around 1,800 metres above sea level. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius, and they were around 75 kilometres from the South Magnetic Pole. As close as they were to their goal, they agreed that this was their safe limit of their journey, and they would begin their trek back to the hut the following day. All three were bitterly disappointed at not having reached their target. Hurley wrote in his diary, quote, "I feel quite sorrowful to give up our trek over this lonely plateau that seems to lure us on in its bright sunshine. I feel as if something has been won, yet something behind these great ice ridges that seems to beckon us, eager to unfold its secrets to the civilized world. Yet it is not to be." The decision to turn back was a sensible one given their food stores. At this time, they only had 8 days' worth of food with them, and they would have to be careful with it to make it back to the Lucky Depot, where there was a further 10 days' worth of food cached. This would then give them sufficient supplies to make it to the first supply depot, laid down by their support team, which would give them what they needed to make it back to the hut. 6 days later, on the 27th of December, they made it to the Lucky Depot and celebrated a late Christmas dinner. For starters, they had what they called angels on gliders, which was a single raisin on a piece of fried chocolate. The main meal was based around the pemmican, which they combined with biscuits, sugar, raisins, snow, and 3 drops of methylated spirits. All the ingredients were boiled for 5 minutes in a sock and then eaten with relish. Buoyed perhaps by their delicious meal, the extra supplies, and the fact that they were on the return, and mostly downhill, leg of their journey, they made the decision to try to break the record for the longest single-day journey undertaken pulling a sled. The following day, they made their attempt. They attached a makeshift sail to the sled and covered an incredible 66 kilometres in 22 hours. With such a huge distance covered in such a short period, they found themselves well ahead of schedule, so they decided to increase their daily rations, but kept 3 days' worth aside as an emergency supply. Their fortunes turned, however, and just 2 days later, Hurley and Page were both suffering from snow blindness. Page, who had it worse, had to ride on the sled for several hours, which slowed their progress considerably. By the 3rd of January, they figured they were less than 20 kilometres from the final depot and were desperately keen to avoid missing it, as they'd been forced to start rationing food. By this time, the weather was awful, and their progress, for days on end, was agonisingly slow. They were also not entirely sure of their location, with the magnetic fields disrupting their compass readings, and the weather depriving them of their primary navigation aid, the sun. Over the next few days, they explored both east and west, but were unable to find the final cache. With just 1 full day's rations remaining, they decided to abandon their search. They estimated they could still reach the hut in 5 days, so they implemented strict rationing. They were forced to ditch some of their scientific equipment and non-essential stores. Cold, weak, and battling constant blizzards, they trudged on, hoping, more than knowing, that they were heading in the correct direction. The following day, the 9th of January, they found themselves overlooking the sea. The 3 men were dumbfounded, as their calculations had them at least 40 kilometres away from the coastline. However, being so far wrong with their calculations meant that they did not know if the hut was to the east or to the west. They decided to go west. Hurley was still suffering badly from snow blindness, so he kept close to the sled, but Bage was out in front, eager to catch sight of a familiar landmark. He walked up a snow bridge and, pointing further west, yelled, "Look!" before, in front of both of his horrified companions, he fell through the snow and disappeared. Webb crept to the edge and carefully looked down. Beige, at the end of his safety rope and swinging like a pendulum, was still pointing and, incredibly, laughing. Webb followed where he was pointing and saw it. Aladdin's cave. They were safe. The three men piled into the safety of the cave and took full advantage of the supplies left in there for just such an occasion. And the following day they made the relatively short trip back to the hut. Their expedition had been a resounding scientific success, reaching the southern magnetic pole notwithstanding. They had charted the land for 450 kilometres south into the Antarctic interior, as well as making frequent magnetic observations along the way. As they rushed back into the hut, the inhabitants were shocked at their sorry state. The radio operator, Hannum, wrote, quote, "They looked like so many bags of bones with plenty of sharp points sticking out." Part of what had made their journey so miserable was how wet it had been. Only on 6 out of the 60 days they were out of the hut had they been able to dry out their sleeping bags. On returning to the hut, they caught up with the adventures and activities of the others there, but they were surprised to see so few people. They had assumed that they would have been the last of the three main parties to return, given that they'd only arrived a few days prior to the final deadline, but they were actually the first. The Eastern Party, made up of Madigan, McLean and Carrell, was still out exploring the eastern coast, as was the Far Eastern Party, comprised of Mawson, Ninnis and Mertz. A further two groups, made up of men who'd been part of the support teams, or who'd been based in the hut to begin with, had set out on smaller expeditions. One of these, led by the mechanical engineer Bickerton, had left to take the tractor as far to the west as possible, with the party members undertaking surveying and other observations as they went. A final sledging party, made up of the taxidermist Lazaron, the geologist Stilwell, and the general tradesman Close, had also set out to the east, aiming to fill in the sections of the map that were not being covered by either the eastern or far eastern parties. The following day, the 12th of January, there came a knock at the door. The men in the hut looked at each other in puzzlement. Any member of one of the expedition parties would just enter the hut, but who else could it be? The door was opened to reveal Captain Davis and two of his crew bearing provisions and mail from home. The Aurora had arrived the previous day, but it had to berth out of sight from the hut. The expedition team members were overjoyed to see Captain Davis and the Aurora for several reasons. First, they had spoken to no one except each other for the best part of a year, and were keen to hear news of the outside world, especially as the wireless continued to be problematic, and only provide them with sporadic and fragmented messages. Additionally, all of the men knew that the arrival of the Aurora signalled the end of their time in Antarctica. Many of the expedition members had begun to think of the place as a, quote, blizzard-hounded desolation. Davis had been surprised at the change in all of the men at the hut since he had last seen them. In his diary he wrote, quote, "To us they had the appearance almost of strangers, a band of wild, hairy veterans whose looks bore little resemblance to the hopeful young men we had landed here a year ago." The first of the remaining expedition parties that made it back to the hut was the Near East Party of Lazaron, Stilwell and Close. They had collected geological and biological samples along the way, but had been very focused and methodical in their mapping, so much so that they only progressed a few kilometres each day. On the 16th of January, the Eastern Party of Madigan, McLean and Carrell made it back, cold and exhausted after nearly 10 weeks away from the hut. They too had suffered their share of mishaps, with both Madigan and Carrell having fallen into deep crevasses. McLean is said to have taken it as a personal affront that he was the only one without such an experience. Their journey, also of around 450 kilometres, took them far along the coast, and they had found traces of plant fossils in a rocky outcrop, suggesting that the land had not always been such a formidable and inhospitable place. On their journey home, they had started to run out of food and found the going slow trying to haul their sled over soft snow. The terrible weather had also kept them inside the tent for several days, and they were forced to ration their food. On one occasion, when they were just a few kilometres out from a supply depot, the three men had not eaten for close to 30 hours while they waited for a break in the weather. Madigan decided to push on towards the depot on foot to get some food rather than the three of them haul the sled towards it. He struggled through thigh-deep snow for nearly 12 hours to get to the cache and back. His going was so slow that he was able to call out to the others to get the kettle on, and a cup of tea was waiting for him by the time he made it to the tent 15 minutes later. The men made it back to the hut without further mishap. 2 days later, on the 18th of January, the Western Party, led by Bickerton, arrived back in the hut. The tractor had initially worked well, but had broken down completely just 15 kilometres from the hut. The three men had pushed on by foot and covered a distance of around 250 kilometres. The main scientific discovery of their journey was a meteorite, the first one ever found in Antarctica. At this point, the only remaining party that had not yet returned was the Far Eastern Party of Mawson, Ninnis and Mertz. Chapter 9. East. Mawson, Ninnis and Mertz had with them 3 sleds and 16 dogs. The strongest 8 dogs were to pull 2 of the sleds, with the other 8 dogs pulling the remaining sled. The 2 sleds pulled together were each more lightly loaded than the single sled, with the idea being that as the food supplies dwindled, they could ditch that sled, as it would have the most worn runners, and just use the 2 remaining sleds individually. One of the dog packs was led by Mawson, and the other by Ninnis. Mertz, as a champion skier, took his place out in front of the other 2 on his skis, pointing out hazards and navigating the best way forward. The 3 sleds had a combined weight of around 500 kilograms, and was made up of scientific equipment, photographic tools, food for 3 men for 9 weeks, food for the dogs, cooking fuel, as well as clothes, weapons and ammo. While the other expedition parties had supply depots laid down for them, this was not possible for the Far Eastern group, as they planned to do a loop circuit rather than a more straightforward there and back again, which all of the other parties had done. So the group had to take more supplies than the others, as they would not have the opportunity to resupply along the way. One way the group intended to save weight was on the dog food. It was decided that as the human food was consumed, the sleds would get lighter, and so fewer dogs would be required to pull them. Therefore, instead of requiring even more weight to be added with extra dog food, the men would simply shoot and kill the excess dogs, which would provide food for the remaining dogs. At some point, there would be insufficient supplies to require the use of multiple sleds, so they would ditch the excess weight and combine everything down to a single sled pulled by all the remaining dogs. The plan was for there to be just 2 dogs left when they returned back to the hut. The early days of their trip were hampered by incredibly strong winds and many hidden crevasses. Ninnis fell into these the most, falling into 3 crevasses in 3 days, including once as they made camp, having not realised that their chosen resting spot was on a 3-metre wide crevasse. However, their spirits were high. Mawson seldom praised the others out loud, but in his diary he noted that both Ninnis and Mertz were always willing to help, and that both were the keenest to go on this adventure. As their food stocks, both their own and their dogs, diminished, they implemented the first phase of their plan, and ditched the most worn of the 3 sleds and put all of the supplies on the 2 remaining sleds. Mawson rode the front sled, which was more lightly loaded, just in case there were any mishaps or hidden hazards. Ninnis took the more heavily laden rear sled, as well as the 8 strongest dogs. The dog in charge of Ninnis's team was Basilisk, the strongest of all of the dogs. Leading Mawson's team was Ginger, and the team included her daughter, Pavlova, the dog who had been born on the journey from London and had been named by Ninnis in order of the meeting with Anna Pavlova when they left Australia all those long months ago. On the 14th of December, they packed up their tent and equipment as usual and set off for the day's trek. The weather was fair, so Mertz, ranging ahead on his skis, could be heard singing. The only other sounds Mawson heard were the panting of the dogs, the clinking and rattling of the harnesses, and the hiss of the sled as it glided across the snow. He heard Mertz call from out front, pointing out a potentially treacherous patch of snow. Mawson raised his hand in acknowledgement and carefully guided his dog team across the snow. Once safely on the other side, he signalled to the following Ninnis, indicating the spot, and then carried on after Mertz. A short while later, Mawson looked up and was surprised to see Mertz standing motionless in the snow ahead, staring back the way they had come. Mawson, puzzled, turned and looked behind. There was nothing there, just snow. Ninnis, the dogs, and the sled had vanished. The 2 men raced back along the tracks made by Mawson's sled until they came to the edge of a large crevasse over 3 metres across. On the other side they could see the tracks of 2 sleds leading up to the far edge. The 2 men carefully approached the edge of the crevasse and peered into the open space below. They couldn't see much, but what they saw confirmed their worst fears. They saw some broken timbers of the sled, some scattered equipment, and the feebly struggling body of one of the dogs. But of the rest of the dogs, the bulk of the equipment, and Belgrave Ninnis, there was no sign. Mertz was frantic. He screamed over and over into the gaping hole, but there was no reply. He pleaded with Mawson to be allowed to go down to attempt a rescue, and was only dissuaded from this when it was impressed upon him that they didn't have enough rope. The 2 men stayed at the edge for hours, continuing to call out, hoping and praying that Ninnis would reply. But he never did. The dog they could see eventually stopped moving, and Mawson led Mertz back to the last sled to take stock. The risk of their idea of having Ninnis take most of the equipment quickly became apparent. They were left with the weaker set of dogs, none of the tent poles or the ice axe, and they had lost most of the food. They had around 10 days' food left to last them a journey which, by Mawson's reckoning, would take 6 weeks, even if the weather was kind. Mawson knew they would have to begin severely rationing themselves, and they would be limited to around a third of the food intake they would have consumed normally. The 2 men discussed the best route to take. Heading to the coast first had appeal because it would give them opportunities to hunt seals and penguins to supplement their low food stocks. But it was an unknown and longer route, so they decided to stay inland and try to retrace their steps as much as possible. Having made a plan, the 2 men returned to the crevasse. They called and listened for a further hour, and then Mawson gave the eulogy while Mertz wept uncontrollably. Mertz wrote in his diary that night, quote, "We could do nothing, really nothing. We were standing, helplessly, next to a friend's grave, my best friend of the whole expedition. We read a prayer in Mawson's prayer book. This was our only consolation, the last honouring we could do for our beloved friend Ninnis. Our only comfort was the thought that the death was a straight path from a happy life." Belgrave Ninnis had been just 25 years old. With heavy hearts, they said their final farewells and made to leave. Before they made their trek west back to the hut, they decided to revisit the sled they had abandoned a few days previously to strip it for parts. As they prepared to leave, they shot George, the weakest of their remaining sled dogs. They ate some of him themselves and fed the rest to the 5 dogs left. They also fed the dogs some surplus leather scraps and mittens. On the return journey, Mawson began to suffer from snow blindness. He had goggles that could protect against this condition, but they fogged up easily and were not always worn. The pain was intense, despite the use of zinc and cocaine tablets under the eyelids. Mawson bandaged one of his eyes to protect it from the glare of the snow. In addition to the lack of food, they struggled to stay warm and dry. With the loss of the tent poles, they'd had to construct some makeshift ones out of skis and the legs of a theodolite. As the pitch of the tent was not as it should be, any water that formed onto the inside of the tent fell onto the occupants in droplets rather than running down the sides. Each time they put up the tent, they faced a choice. If they put on fire, then it would be warm, but the dripping water would mean that nothing would be dry. If they didn't start a fire, they would be dry, but cold. The two men spoke often about food. Mertz declared that when they got back to the hut, the first thing he would do would be to make his famous penguin omelettes. They had frequent dreams about food, but most of them ended before they could eat anything. Mawson had one when he was in a confectioner's shop and was taken upstairs to where there were a large number of delicious cakes. He chose one and paid for it and left the shop before realizing he didn't have the cake with him. He rushed back to the store, but it was closed. It was at this point he awoke, hungrier and more miserable than ever. Mawson conceded that in dire straits they would have to eat their deerskin shoes, but both men knew that if it came to that, then they were as good as dead anyways, as they would soon succumb to frostbite without their shoes. One by one, the remaining dogs were killed. While both men had known that this was part of the plan to survive the expedition all along, it still troubled them both, especially as they had had to ditch their gun to save weight, and the last two dogs were killed with a knife. The second to last dog to die was Pavlova. Mawson had written in his diary that she had been his favourite. She was killed and eaten on Christmas Day 1912. The final dog that was killed was Ginger, the leader of Mawson's sled dog pack. They had tried to keep her alive as long as they could, but when she got too weak to even walk beside the sled, they made the final decision to kill her and eat her. They made a soup from the contents of her skull and ate it using a spoon fashioned from an old sled runner. By the end of December, and around 2 weeks after Ninnis had died, Mawson noticed a decline in Mertz. The difference in the men's health and outlook can be seen in what each wrote in their diaries at the time. Mawson wrote, quote, "Tramping over the plateau where reigns the desolation of the outer worlds, in solitude at once ominous and weird, one is free to roam in imagination through the whole realm of human experience to the bounds of the great beyond." Mertz simply wrote, "As I am tired, I write no more." Both men found the dog meat to be tough and hard to eat, but Mertz complained of it more, so he was given more of the tastier and easier to digest liver. It is speculated that it was the large amounts of dog liver that Mertz ate that caused his health to decline faster, as dog liver has extremely high concentrations of vitamin A, which can be deadly to humans, a fact that was not known at the time. Mertz was also at a disadvantage, as his waterproof overtrousers had been lost with the rest of the equipment on Ninnis's sled, and he struggled to stay dry, which sapped his energy further. Day by day, Mertz's condition worsened. He was soon unable to sit on the sledge even for days with favourable conditions. By this point, his hands were badly frostbitten. Possibly in delirium, he claimed that it wasn't possible for him to get frostbite, as he was good in the cold, and bit off the top of a finger in an attempt to prove it to them both. Not long after, Mertz had practically shut down. It is speculated that he was in shock over the death of his close friend Ninnis, and there'd been no time allowed to grieve or to process it. This, coupled with the terrible conditions, lack of food, the poisonous dog liver, and the exertion, would have taken an enormous toll on him in both body and mind. By the 7th of January, Mertz could only be transported on the back of the sled for a few kilometres before the cold got too much for him. Mawson bundled him into the tent where Mertz would rave incoherently and was afflicted by frequent fits. Mawson spoon-fed him water and soup and had to keep him from trying to get out of the sleeping bag in the tent. At this point, their forward progress had slowed to a halt. Mawson knew that their food was running out and that to stay with Mertz was almost certainly a death sentence for them both. However, he did not even consider leaving his companion, even if it meant his own death. In the early hours of the 8th of January 1913, Mawson woke. He reached across to his companion and found him to be stone cold. Dr. Xavier Mertz was dead.